Yo, what is going on, my fellow weebs? Colonel here, and welcome back to the channel. So today we have the Faded Katana Braver interview. In case this is like your first video or you're new here, you're curious, what are we talking about? So we're actually going around and interviewing individual players that represent their classes, players that push their classes to the absolute best, some of the best, top 1%, so on and so forth. We're looking at people that are making the guides, people that are speedrunning the content, people that are completing challenges that no one else is completing. And talking back, basically pulling back the veil on some of the common misconceptions about the class. So those of you guys who may have seen, my YouTube channel or seen my Twitch streams know that I'm not someone who plays a ton of different classes all the time. However, I do have the privilege of being able to communicate and connect with a lot of players who are very, very skilled at the classes that they play. So I do get a lot of information from those outside sources. And honestly, I figured, you know what? I can't just sit here and tell you guys that, hey, I know what I'm talking about. Might as well go ahead and bring these people in. That way they can go ahead and tell you themselves. I feel like it'd be a much better overall interaction, and you guys can get some more information from someone who really has put that time into the class and can tell you on your end. That, and if you don't listen to them, I don't know who you'll listen to. But I digress. Let's go ahead and jump into this. In case you guys haven't seen the previous interviews, they'll all be in a playlist along with this one. So shout out to those individuals we've already done interviews for. We should have some more on the horizon as I get them scheduled. This has been a very long project, so I appreciate you guys for sticking through it with me. But I have rambled on in the intro long enough. Let's go ahead and get over to Gin. All right, so here we are. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure thing. So, hello everybody. My name is Sakata in game name, but people know me by my main character, Otsuu. I've been in NGS and PSO2 Braver main since Braver launch and global closed beta respectively. Also author of the NGS Katana Braver guide, which you can get to from Fleet Discord or any of my channels. And the guide actually just celebrated its second anniversary of circulation, so lots of updates over time for that.
Awesome. I didn't even know that, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And then just a little bit about me, just a little over 2.5 years of sort of on again, off again NGS Katana Braver speedrunning. I started out with Fleeting Fight in Alio era because that was kind of the only one of the very few things to do at the time. And it was one of the few things Braver could kind of do okay at the time as well because it was in rough shape. Currently on a semi-break, but I'm starting to kind of come out of hibernation again with some things coming up in terms of content. In the past, I've had several top 25, top 10, top 5 ARCS record finishes on Ship 2 Global. Things ranging from Geolab Rank 2 to Ordinal Tower, variety of Trainia. Most recently, I was the #1 Braver time for Bujin in Global, and I was only just about a second behind the top JP time for that. So that was good. And most of my stuff's Katana only, but I will sometimes use Hybrid Braver depending on the content and what the need is for particular things, especially in the older party challenges.
Gotcha.
And then also have a variety of records on the unofficial NGS leaderboards for a variety of things like purple triggers and Dark Files Solace and the like. And then really I was a pretty casual base PSO2 player until episode 6 Global released. A friend of mine introduced me to Mill's YouTube channel. He's an old school Braver, and I know he goes back some ways in Fantasy Star Online and PSU.
Far back. A lot of us looked at Mill's stuff.
And kind of, I think the first video I saw by him was watching him run Sodom depth 100, and that was really kind of eye-opening because I hadn't had a lot of experience with action RPGs like this. I played a little Warframer, a little bit of Monster Hunter World, but I was more of an FPS player in my younger days. So this is kind of relatively new territory for me in terms of my sort of broader gamer arc. But I've been going hard ever since episode 6. So that's kind of my who I am and what I do.
Yeah, so you've been playing for quite some time. It sounds like not as long as some of the other people I've interviewed or myself. But yeah, no, I feel like if you went into the speedrunning territory or in even hardcore content territory, whether it be good or bad, as I've had great standings sometimes and awful standings with Milne, depending upon the situation itself. So it's a little bit of back and forth sometimes, but as it is, as it be, with online anything nowadays. You kind of just had that sort of experience of seeing someone absolutely crush some content. I actually ended up doing a full 1 to 100 climb with just soaring blades on Etoile after watching after watching a JP creator actually crush their solo Sodom 100. So yeah, definitely some cool stuff to check out there. And like I said, you've had quite a bit of an experience with the game. Fleeting was it Fleeting Feet? Bujin, basically Cocoon, was all we had to do for a long time for a while. So I definitely was there. I definitely messed around with that too. The Bujin solo, or even just soloing Bujin at the beginning of the Purple Trigger when those came out, to see how good the times could be. Actually had the fastest time recorded at the very least that I saw on YouTube for a little while, which was pretty fun. But then people don't always leave everything online. First to find, and finding things on the JP community is not always the easiest, but yeah, so quite the background.
Posters.
They're not, and a lot of times it's I know a lot of people don't always see these things, but a lot of times there is stuff available. It's just how you have to search for it's a little bit different, due to the whole language barrier thing. So either way, not to go too far into a into a tangent, but yes, you've got quite a bit of experience with the class, obviously. Going from just playing it a lot yourself to making the guide. So quite a lot to cover here today, and a nice mix of hybrid bravery in there is actually pretty helpful because it'll lead into some of our conversations today. So with these, we kind of just jump directly into them with individual sides of things. So let's start out with what we usually start out with strengths. So as a Katana braver, specifically in this case, what are some strengths you feel like Katana has that maybe not every other class has access to, but Katana does just really, really, really well?
I think the first thing I'll say is, and when people ask me, why do Katana, why play Katana? Katana has a very well-rounded kit. It has a pretty complete kit in and of itself. So it's capable of being very good with bossing, and it's also capable of being decent to okay with mobbing situations. So you can use it in a variety of situations. It has some decent, but I would say not terribly great mobility that was added in later with PA4 from Radiant Lilac. And then, as with many classes in NGS, I think Katana is at its best when there are more counter opportunities in a fight. So the weapon especially shines when you're able to do things like chaining counters. So doing your guard counter or weapon action counter, depending on what you call it, into other guard counters, chaining those together, like next fire, breath. You can do fearless attitudes in the guard counter, or you can do fearless or guard counter into step counters, into PA3 and normal plus. So there's a variety of tools available to it, depending on what kind of incoming attack is coming at you, and Katana has different ways of dealing with it. So from a counter standpoint, I would say Katana has a pretty dynamic kit. Katana is also very good at being a melee turret, as a lot of people call it. It has a very rooted gameplay style. This is also a liability. So when we kind of go later and probably talk about what Katana doesn't do so well, I think this will be a big topic of discussion here. And the thing I like to say is, the Katana Braver has aggro when the boss isn't moving much or isn't moving as much as it possibly could. That's really kind of key to Braver's gameplay, particularly Katana Braver. It really owes to a couple of things. One is the changes to Lotus Lightning and guard counter range in Redum era, which allowed it to have much more reach and not have to move as much. The addition of Counter Plus and PA Combo Finisher was another important addition. And then the range extension and cooldown reduction for Brave Combat Finisher in a kind of a more recent update. I think it was late last year. That was another key thing that sort of allows a Katana Braver to have a fairly significant radius to be able to attack from. So yes, it's somewhat of a rooted gameplay style, but for a melee weapon, it does have decent range and decent reach to allow it to deal with bosses at different ranges. For higher level players, there are a number of things that are really fun and interesting about deeper Katana gameplay. I'd say most Photon Arts, Counter Plus, and PA Combo Finisher have really helpful mid and end animation cancel frames. And oftentimes those are your fillers in between when you can't fit a full PA. The other thing is being able to set up near frame perfect fearless attitude, which can then set up sequences that otherwise wouldn't fit with a guard counter. So that's another kind of interesting option that people have when they kind of dig more into the weapon is you have an even faster counter than your weapon action available to you from a frame standpoint. And then the relatively recent addition of step counter skip arts actually opened up a lot of options for Katana with the ability to hold or store a PA 3+ under certain circumstances. So you could do a step counter into a weapon action and still be able to use your third step buffed PA, for example. So there's different sequences in which that's become actually quite important, particularly with things like Darkfell Solace and MDFA. And then kind of the last kind of advanced thing is at times, this is useful but not always ideal, is a lot of our PAs have leading guard frames, as does our PA Combo Finisher. And that can be helpful in certain situations. Normally, it's not ideal to not counter something, but on occasion that sometimes isn't possible. So that those leading guard frames with that little bit of hit stop can be helpful to player if there needs to be sort of an intentional panic button and your other options aren't available to you for some reason.
Gotcha. So yeah, I mean, I've said this a lot in conversations via streams and things like that, having conversations with individuals. We talk about a lot of balancing stuff all the time, and one thing that does come up a lot of times is that like it may not be from the damage perspective. I'm gonna kind of spoil things for you guys. We've had this conversation before. This is the second recording. We're just doing a more updated one. There were some issues, so it's no worries. So there are some things I already know about. Okay, I'm cheating a little bit, but that's okay. But I've had conversations with my Twitch chat beforehand that Katana, realistically, when it came to melee weapons, it felt, I mean, outside of like, the mobility conversation, because there's a little bit to be wanting when it comes to mobility. Well, I'll give you that. But everything else felt like almost the most complete kit any weapon in the game has before they released Slayer. Slayer has some other things going on or whatever, but like Katana just felt like, man, it kind of had a little bit of everything that was necessary for almost every situation. So outside of damage, of course, everyone's going to think about damage. We're going to talk about damage, and I've always said Katana suffers from its own success, which we'll get into that later on. But like it just really had a lot of things going on for it. It was, and all those things, yeah, it sounds like it does quite a bit, even more in depth. And there are things I've learned, at least from this conversation that we've had beforehand, that Katana could do that I was just completely unaware of. And I thought I had seen just about everything when it came to Katana. So yeah, no, it's a lot of the things are really awesome. And a lot of the reasons why I actually personally, people ask, what question or what weapon would you recommend someone start with? Katana's the thing that comes up a lot. I mean, outside of just its overall style, the weapon is pretty solid. It does well where it does well. Was there anything else that we kind of glossed over or missed over that you wanted to go ahead and include?
No, I think we covered a lot of it. I think just really the biggest thing to keep in mind, again, with what Katana's good at is it's good when there's a lot of incoming fire, but there's kind of another edge to that. And when we kind of get into class weaknesses, I'll talk to that. And that's like things like it does have a strong burst option, for example, in Brave Combat Finisher, but it beyond that, it does have some struggles. So it's definitely something we'll get into later. But
For sure, for
definitely
sure.
risk putting yourself in positions to be constantly taking potential incoming damage. That's where Katana is at its very strongest. And quite frankly, the Fearless Attitude is probably the single best counter in the game right now.
Hmm.
But there are now circumstances and content now where that's become sort of a less relevant mechanic depending on what you're doing. So that's something we can get into a little later too.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And yeah, as long as you are in specific, I guess I'll add to that fearless attitude. Definitely, I would say is probably the best counter in the game. The short frame version of it makes basically getting almost frame perfect fearless attitude. The longer it waits, the worse it kind of gets over time. But something we can kind of talk about a little bit later, of course. But yeah, no, for sure, it's definitely got its strengths, and it actually, as you think about it more and more, it actually follows a similar situation to the Scion classes back from base PSO2, where Hero was an insanely powerful class, assuming the target was highly aggressive. When the target stopped being highly aggressive, its damage started to fall off a lot more comparatively to its other Scion brothers, the Phantom and the Luster. So definitely a conversation I have had multiple times with classes beforehand. But moving past our strengths, we kind of blew right through the strengths. They're fairly straightforward, much like I feel like Katana is in a lot of situations. A fairly straightforward weapon, nothing too complicated, just high levels of nuance that you can kind of mix in there as well. Let's go to the opposite side. I'm sure we have plenty to say here, as most people tend to when it comes to their weapons. What are Katana's weaknesses? Where are some of its struggles? Something that you're like, man, you know what? I can do this, but it kind of sucks to have to do. Where we find those problems?
Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit just before we started this conversation, and that's I think the worst feature, and it's been persistently I think the worst feature of Katana is when it's in a sandbag or down situation.
Mm-hmm.
Katana's best sandbag rotation is not only PP inefficient and somewhat unsustainable, um, because long downs do require some advanced planning to avert having to insert normal attacks into a down rotation. So you are at times very much paying attention to sort of the move sets that lead up to when you kind of think a down will happen.
Mm-hmm.
And less than ideal move sets or setups going into a down can really drag down your DPS. So um, one example where I really struggled with Katana at times until I had to make significant adjustments to how I was approaching this was the phase transition between the end of phase one for Darkfile Solace, and that oftentimes I kind of early on in my running that particularly solo, PP management was a huge issue, depending
Mm-hmm.
on sort of what move preceded the platforms rising up, and then you kind
Mm-hmm.
of going into that DPS check mode. Break also the DPS output of its sandbag rotation, which is Lotus 1 2 3 PA combo finisher, isn't great. A lot of times Katana alone and like Solus, going back to Solus, which is pretty old content at this point, but it's kind of the
Mm-hmm.
freshest example that I can think of where this came up. Um, you were, in fact, better off usually using bow in those circumstances if you were playing hybrid, um, both from a PP management standpoint, but also in terms of a damage output standpoint. So that's one major issue, is that its sandbag rotation isn't great output wise. It did get a little better when the Tech Arts customization came out for Lotus Lightning, but um, we can talk a little bit later about that. But the gist is Lotus Lightning Type 3 gives you about a 5% boost,
Mm-hmm.
and it really nominally comes out to about 3.5% when you factor in the PA combo finisher into the rotation as well. So it helped a little bit. It showed that SEGA was focusing on the right thing and moving in the right direction with kind of rectifying things that weren't so ideal with Katana's kit. But it's even at like percent, and then again that roughly 3.5% when you factor in the combo finisher. It didn't move the needle by that much for Lotus on downs. Um, the next thing, and I alluded to this a little bit in this at the end of the strengths discussion, was um, more recent content. So like your Stalker Solus, MDFA, has placed a huge emphasis on burst DPS. And to be really honest, Katana is not a burst DPS weapon in the same way that some other weapons are, like right now, Slayer and Hunter and the like. Pre-fired Brave Combat Finisher is probably its best burst option, and frankly, its only burst option. Followed up by setting up, like, for example, step counter skip arts into like a sandbag situation. So if anybody watched Ribeye's Katana only clear of MDFA recently, you see that he was using a sequence where it was step counter into Radiant Lilac 3 buffed, and then delaying his BA combo finisher to hit if another claw was coming in to hit the claws. So that's the type of thing that Katana players are having to do now to try to squeeze as much burst as possible, but it's really not ideal. So it really struggles when it doesn't have persistent contact with the enemy, essentially. I mentioned a little bit before in when I was talking about sandbagging, but for burst, hybrid bravers will often use bow in certain things. So Encore jump, of course, is going to change here very shortly. If by the time people hear this recording, the Encore jump will have a change, will probably actually be in place. So Encore charged flex was a pretty significant tool in the hybrid bravers toolkit. So it'll be interesting to kind of see changes. But even so, like charged ceaseless with dim ray stacks, pre-firing supercharged flex. In some cases, you could even exploit the leading guard frames on supercharged flex to provide extra burst. That's better than really most of Katana's inherent burst options. And that really became the case, especially when bow attack impact was implemented. Even so, bow, as many people know, bow suffers from pretty significant damage output issues. So it's very telling that one of the weapons that's suffering the most from a damage perspective provides Braver's best burst.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, like, I've had that conversation with Chumbo, and it's pretty sad when you're thinking about, like, and it's mostly like just taking advantage of the short moments that you can kind of build on Braver's burst or Braver's burst, but taking advantage of those moments and then going back to Katana afterwards. But like, it's pretty telling when you're thinking of like that's your best option, really, when it comes to burst damage.
The best option intrinsic to Braver, I will say. There is a better option, but that's also being revised in an upcoming patch, which will probably be in place by the time folks hear this. I would say the last big issue that Katana has, and I talked about it in the strength section, is that yes, while Katana is a very strong rooted fighter, when the boss faints or moves away or retreats or flies away, those are huge problems for Katana. Yeah, Katana doesn't do so well with that, and that's sort of the other edge of the sword of being a good melee turret, is that it's terrible to have to move a lot with Katana. So because of this, in party play in particular, this comes up a lot when you're playing off aggro. It can be actually pretty challenging. So like Ragras, for example, is a boss that playing off aggro with Katana, given all of the movement, it's very, very, very difficult to deal with that. Because ideally, if Katana in a solo situation is not going to move much, and it's going to let Ragras sort of orbit around it to be able to farm all sort of the incoming bullets and all of the slashes. Whereas if, like, for example, a Slayer is holding down aggro or a Waker is holding down aggro, they're in a better position to handle Ragras's movements, and then it becomes very difficult. The Katana players are often having to chase to kind of farm to be able to farm counters or maintain DPS.
Okay.
We do have a movement option I mentioned earlier, Radiant Lilac. It's okay. Sometimes it's a little finicky. One of the bigger issues it has too is there's no vertical tracking, so we don't have the equivalent of a Shunka from base Katana Braver's toolkit. And it's also for folks paying attention to Katana closely, they'll notice like you have to have it soft lock and within sort of soft line of sight on a mob or a boss to get the most out of travel distance. If you try to use Lilac without a soft or hard lock, it doesn't move you by very much. So that can be somewhat problematic. It's a movement PA that really only works when you're sort of within the striking range of the thing you're trying to move towards or away from, depending. So those are kind of the three big things that Katana really struggles with now, and I think recent content, in particular on the burst DPS piece, really kind of showed where Katana's biggest weakness is right now, and that's the ability to burst.
Yeah, a lot of content recently is coming out that is, funny enough, that's actually a little less pushing on like countering all the time. I know that was like something that they talked about in headlines and things like that, where I guess players were like, I want to say complaining. I feel like that's kind of like a one guy situation, but where they wanted to start implementing fights where you were dealing with like getting out of the way of damage more often than you were with consistently countering, because up to that point, at least up till Solus was released, you basically countered everything. Even if it wasn't like a situation where you could deal damage back to the target, you could essentially step counter or block or counter just about everything. You can't block a grab, obviously, but you can counter just about everything in the game. Solus was like the first time where we had something that like legitimately like, hey, if you don't get out of this, you're going to take damage no matter what you do. So it was a pretty interesting situation. And as content has started to release more and more, we're starting to see more content that like, you know, with MDFA, where the, you know, lasers that you literally can't do anything about, you have to get out of the way of. And for those who don't, or I meant to mention this earlier with the context when we're talking about, you know, sandbagging content. More so like just dealing with downs. Whenever a target is knocked on the ground, when they're not moving, when they're not fighting back, or when you're just trying to push out damage on something where you're almost hitting it like it's a dummy. That's kind of where that struggle type starts to come in, where I would just like, for on Bouncer's end, and I'll say this because for some reason people believe that I think that, you know, Bouncer can never be touched and Braver has to suffer. On Bouncer's end, we have really high damage when it comes to our PAs. So for the funniest thing I used to say for the longest time before they did the Bouncer rework was, we're really great at fighting something that's not fighting back. Braver was the opposite. They're great at fighting something that's fighting back, but if it's not fighting back, it's an issue. Things, of course, have changed with Bouncer moving forward, so we have better blocks and things like that. But that was kind of like the idea, and that really fits into a lot of content now, where you are just pushing out large amounts of burst damage under specific circumstances, under certain downs, under certain attacks, things like that. And though Braver is like very, I would say, consistent in a sense. When you're in, feel free to interrupt or correct me if I'm wrong. But feels very consistent in a sense. A lot of pieces of content, like you can just kind of you just kind of flow, as long as you're fighting and the enemy's fighting, things just kind of flow. When they stop swinging is when it kind of starts to fall down. You're running out of PP and you're using attacks that just aren't super great for your overall kit. So yeah, I know that could be really difficult, especially if boss design continues the way that it has been. Definitely would like to see some tweaks happen there, but I know we talked about some weaknesses, and there was one that I like to usually kind of touch on, because not everyone overall sees it as a weakness. It's kind of like a concern for some people. They're like, hey, this is a super awesome strength. But after talking with you about it, I kind of saw it. I was like, okay, and I can see where this is a problem. And it's kind of like Braver's or Katana's overall safety. One thing that I do is I recommend Katana to a lot of people because it teaches you a lot of really great things. You have access to a lot of iframes, have access to a lot of damage. After post iframe and things like that, you can continuously keep up damage. And you have access to that incredible reach while you're fighting something. So it just feels good as you're starting to learn to fight something. Do you want to talk a little bit about how, like, you know, that isn't always the best situation to be in?
Yeah, so I would say that's one of the things that I would like to dispel.
Mhm.
A common myth is that katana is easy because it's perceived to be more forgiving than a lot of weapons. So on the one hand, yes, it does have pretty good quality of life. It does have a number of safety nets, as you mentioned. So it has a lot of iframes, has
Mhm.
guard frames, leading guard frames in some of its PAs. It has, I would say, semi-hit scan on its PA combo finisher and counter plus, although that doesn't always land, as we've learned in some more recent content, painfully. Um,
That actually can
and
happen. I feel like you guys
it
have the
can,
most hit scan on the
it
counter.
can,
If
it can
if
happen.
anything, if you can miss,
Can,
then we can't win. There's no winning.
yeah,
That's insane.
it can miss.
That's wild.
And it is objectively easier to pick up the basics of katana,
For
but
sure.
then picking up the basics of katana, but then doing the bare minimum, which is basically guard counter followed by C plus, and sort of living and breathing in iframes. That's not going to allow you to do the most possible damage you can do with the weapon. Um, they can do consistent damage, but they're not producing as much damage as they could be if they dug a little deeper into the kit and played riskier. When you get into sort of intermediate to um, sort of speed running levels for Katana, it's a lot about putting yourself into the most possible danger and taking on the most risk to farm for as many counters as possible and squeeze as much as possible in between that. So you are not necessarily operating with the aim of avoiding damage and living in iframes. You're operating with the aim of squeezing as much out of the weapon as possible, to include canceling out of your iframes at times. Um, and if yes, there's always the risk for you messing something up on that and getting hit, and that's how you learn. But even then, getting hit every now and then, playing riskier, is going to do more damage than just guard counter, counter plus, guard counter, counter plus. So that's, I would say, one thing that I did want to try to dispel is that, yes, it does have that quality of life. It does have a lot of safety nets, but that's not how Katana's played ideally. So
Exactly. And that's something I wanted to talk, or at least I didn't want to be the one to talk about, to have you kind of bring up and have us have that conversation, because it's a thing that, as a creator, we mostly deal with the average player. It's going to be the majority of players. So when I say something like, "Hey, look, Katana is a great weapon to pick up because it's very safe," or anything like, "Oh, it teaches you the right moves," things like that, it's because of that low end. No offense to a lot of players, but most people play at that end. They play on a little bit of the lower end of most weapons. It's not everyone that really digs deep into their class or digs deep into their weapon that really tries to push the most out of it. So on the low end, very comfortable, very safe, very understanding. That's not to say that we believe that that's the only way to play the weapon, or that I believe that's the only way to play the weapon, because I totally understand the idea of like living in iframes not being your best case scenario. I wrote an entire video talking about how an ability was an absolute trap back in base game because of that exact situation. Etwell's was it? It's full connect. Literally made an entire video showing frame data on how it was a trap because of the situation that you're referring to right now. So, like, definitely understand that process itself, and definitely understand how that could be a problem. While great from like a very, from a very low skill perspective, not to say that it's a bad thing to be there, but from a very early in, very
no,
basic low skill perspective, it's something that, like, if you're trying to push out the most damage, it's actually working against you in a lot of cases. So
yeah,
totally.
and I think that's part of why it got some of the bad rap that it did. The other piece of it being, I think, counter plus is where a lot of the bad
Mm-hmm.
came from back in the Convaris days, because there really wasn't a lot of content where you did see a drawback to using PA combo finisher or counter plus, and Kavaris Purple in particular was very favorable to Braver in
Mm-hmm.
a lot of respects. Those bosses were just, if you had to come up with a slate of 5 bosses that were extremely Braver friendly, it was 4 of the 5 of those. I would argue Krako wasn't, but The rest of them are.
Croco wasn't great for anyone though, but that's fair.
Yeah, Croco is just pain.
Yeah, Croco kind of sucked, but that's fair.
Croco, Nex, like there's always at least one boss in those purples. But I
It's crazy.
digress.
I always was great with Next. Like Next always felt like a good fight to me, and I wasn't that great at purples. I'm not sure why.
Yeah, and again, it's that's a situation in which it moves a lot, right? And
Yeah,
sometimes it moves
true.
that can be unpredictable, and sometimes there are some things you can do to kind of control its movements as on a player, but sometimes it will just decide to fly straight up, and you have no vertical track, so you have no way to give chase, and in by giving chase, you're losing out on DPS. So it can be pretty difficult. It's not impossible. I think Unicolin actually put out a video recently of his Katana only run in Alio, so like it's definitely manageable, but it's also not ideal, and other classes definitely handle things like Nex or Croco a lot better than Katana.
For sure.
I think since we're talking about myths, I think the other since I'd like to bust another myth before we kind of move on, and that's
Absolutely, go
I
for it.
think there's still sort of a narrative that Katana is overpowered or not really in need of any buffs. And some people will just kind of put out the it's overpowered argument. But other people will kind of take a slightly more nuanced stance and say, well, it's balanced and it has a complete kit, so you don't really need anything else. But I think when you dig into the numbers and you look at things like number of bravers doing solo clears of things more recently, and you look at times, and you look at ARC's records, um, Katana is very solidly mid tier right now, and hybrid is a little slightly better off, and hybrid's typically somewhere between 60-40 and 80-20 Katana bow,
Mm-hmm.
but it's only slightly better off. Um, the real balance, I think, is determined by how much damage output a kit can squeeze into a given time period. And I think recent content, again, has shown Katana really suffers in this department from its relative lack of burst damage. And I think a similar lack of sustainable damage output compared with, I think, some other weapon or class combinations. And sustainable is a really specific term I use there because when I talk about that, I'm talking about two things. First, it's sustainable in terms of your ideal damage output scenarios. So Katana cannot possibly always counter because there's really very little content, especially recently, that allows that. So Katana's options for filling between counters are decent, but not as good as others. And depending on the content, you could end up having to rely on something like Leaf to fill a gap. And that has fairly low output. So that's one thing. Second, sustainable in terms of the ability to maintain output in sort of the no to low counter scenarios. And we talked about this earlier, like you get a long down. Lysentos, the physical down for Lysentos and red and purples is a great example of this. It's not as bad now, but when it originally came out, it was a fairly torturous down sequence because Katana just simply didn't. There simply wasn't enough available PP, and the PP management options available to it just didn't really mitigate the cost of maintaining a Lotus rotation. And this was before the 8 combo finisher, which helped
Mm-hmm.
alleviate some of that. I think Brave Combat can help if you hold it with some advanced planning and anticipating the down. But even then, the name of the game now is recently has been burst. So I think it's less ideal to hold for the full 15 seconds. Whereas I think you're really better off in that time frame double tapping, since it's one of those very few sources of Katana burst damage. So those are kind of that would be kind of the other myth. It's the first myth being Katana's easy. I think that depends on how deeply you dig into it. And that Katana is overpowered, which I think over the last probably 6 months or so, maybe even longer, really hasn't been the case. It's very solidly in the mid tier now.
For sure, for sure. And I think it's a common thought process because of how it almost felt like a knee jerk sort of reaction. Katana was kind of met with, and this is kind of more of like a history sort of thing. So I know you mentioned you played since like global release and stuff like that, but like for those who played for a long period of time, a lot of us kind of dealt with, you know, when something released and there were some changes that were necessary, changes really didn't happen very quickly. I'm not sure if you ever saw the meme of Buff Fighter Forever, but they were screaming about their class needing something or anything at all for 4-5 years upwards of, until finally getting buffs in episode 6 near the end. For a lot of us, it was like seeing Katana release and having the problems that it did, you know, lack of mobility and things of that sort, and like that knee-jerk reaction of, oh god, Katana's already getting buffed, and like, oh, it's getting buffed again. And it's like, oh, it's getting buffed again, when in reality it was like, it's getting fixed. These are things that it really should probably have. A lot of players had that perspective of like, wow, Katana seems kind of like the favorite child at the moment because no one else really got that sort of treatment. But that does also speak to how bad it was when it released, right? Like there were a lot of issues that it experienced off the rip.
It was atrocious when it came out.
Yeah.
In terms of
right, and it's like just you know, the way that they had to deal with things, you know, step countering being the optimal choice, which granted at the time, being someone who played Bouncer for so long, being Storyblade Bouncer for so long, and dealing with, you know, how awful our block basically was after having, or basically not having one for a long time, and how off our weapon action actually was after the fact, you know, it was like, oh, well, you know, you have to step counter. Yeah, boohoo. Welcome to my world. But realistically speaking, when you think about Katana and its weapon action counters, like that was kind of its thing. So I sort of got eventually where the Katana mains were coming from, and where the damage should really be coming from, and that sort of situation. So it definitely is the case. But yeah, no, I don't think, and I think this is like, again, a misconception I feel like that Katana mains even hear for themselves is, I don't think anyone who actually understands damage is calling Katana overpowered. If I'm saying Katana is overpowered, it's I'm envious of your counter, and how snappy it can be. It's I'm envious of the range you might have, and I mean, granted, of the hit scan counter you have, even though now I'm finding out that it's possible for that to whiff. RIP. Hopefully you get the treatment that we got recently over on Bouncer, with our counter actually kind of curving to hit our target a lot easier. But it's kind of crazy that's kind of a mindset, because yeah, no, when it comes to damage, even before Soaring Blade got reworked, Katana was nowhere near. If the target was moving a lot, yeah, maybe you could keep up in that situation. But outside of that, man, it's not a situation that would happen at all. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of, it's a little bit of a silly myth. And I feel like it's still something that's perpetuated longer than it needs to. Katana's not overpowered. I would say your versatility of your kit feels overpowered. The idea that you have access to so many things feels overpowered, but its completeness
is, I would say, something that doesn't exist with a lot of other weapons in the game right now.
It's the envy that we all have as other melee classes.
The closest thing I can compare it to in terms of being a complete weapon would be the gun slash, right? It's like that is a complete weapon in and of itself. Katana is a complete weapon from sort of a mechanics like kit standpoint, but that doesn't mean it's unlike gun slash, it's not in the top tier of damage anymore. And it still has some broader class kit issues that need to be resolved too. So
for sure, absolutely. So yeah, if you guys ever hear that, at least from me, we were like, oh, you said you taught, it's like, you specifically said Katana's overpowered. It has never been about damage. I promise you, it's never been about damage, because let's not sugarcoat that. It's not even close. But hopefully that's something that, you know, that changes in the future. And with that, it's actually a pretty good segment into these. So I'll you know, go ahead and pull back the veil on this one. We're recording this literally during maintenance right now, on the 9th. So if this video doesn't come out within the week, you guys can yell at me. You now have a date. But they're recording this on the 9th. So we have an update coming out that's going to not only shake up a little bit of the Tech Arts customizations, but we should be seeing new ones as well. So we talked about Lotus Lightning having its tech arts customization change, or having its tech arts customization introduced. How did that kind of? I guess you kind of already touched on a little bit with the whole 3% thing. If you want to kind of go into more depth, and um, what would you like to see change with that, and what would you like to see with anything else they'd be adding to the kit? Like, what do you think the next PA is going to be, at least for Katana?
Yeah, so I can start with the PA customization that exists already, and then we can kind of get into kind of more speculative stuff because
Yeah,
um, we don't know, we don't really have any sense as of the moment of this recording what is going to come out tomorrow.
and we checked. I promise we tried. We looked. We have no idea. I
Yeah,
promise I have no information ahead of time. So
I don't have any forbidden knowledge right now on that. So, but Lotus Lightning, like everything else, got three different tech art customizations. Type 1 was a range extension in exchange for increased PP consumption and damage, I believe it was, and loss of damage that is. And that Lotus already had pretty generous range. Um, it didn't really move the bar much for Lotus. I don't think any content really warrants having Lotus be um, able to
yeah, I
hit
was like,
roughly half the length of the Battle Dealer arena.
I feel like it already had some pretty crazy good range, or at least
Yeah,
decent range, right? So like, what would it need to go any further?
that one was a little inexplicable. I feel this Type
Mm-hmm.
2 Lotus customization was a little more interesting, and that's when Brave Combat was up um, in return for sort of increased PP consumption and a reduction in damage. You get a faster Lotus Lightning from a frame perspective, and
Okay.
that one was there was, I think, initial discussion between that and Type 3, which was the 10% boost to Lotus Step 1 and the 5% boost to Lotus Step 2.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but in reality, I think they were Type 2 Lotus was very much something that you would use in edge cases. I'm trying to remember where I last saw it, but think it was I think it was for the Lemnis um, Cocoon Arcs record, and I seem to recall. Actually, it was Ribeyes again. Second time I've mentioned Ribeyes in this interview. He's very good. I think I saw him actually using Type 2 on Towns,
Hmm.
but I'd have to go back and kind of check because it's been a little bit. But that there were very, very, very specific scenarios that didn't really justify kind of having that equipped at all times. And even if you were to use it, you really need to um, do your math ahead of time to determine that was the best option.
Mm-hmm.
And then also on top of that, it requires you to hold your combat for the 15 seconds to get the most out of it, which is also another issue.
Right. Right.
Lotus Type 3 is kind of the default option, and I teased it a little bit earlier. I believe it was a 10% boost to Lotus 1 and a 4% boost to Lotus 2, and it came out to about a 4.9% boost overall to Lotus 1, 2, 3. It was around
Mm-hmm.
3.5% boost when you factor in also PA Combo Finisher.
Mm-hmm.
So it went up about 20 potency per second before you start factoring in like main class bonus and other things. So 394 to 413, I think it was. Um,
Pretty bad.
and I think that was Sega looking at the weapon and going, okay, what does it need?
Mm-hmm.
And it needed some help on downs. So that I think that was somewhat belated. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it helped with downs, and it also did help a little bit with some more recent content because
Mm-hmm.
now Lotus is much more front loaded. Before Lotus, as it stepped, increased in damage.
Mm-hmm.
Now it is the situation that Lotus 1 and Lotus 2 are actually fairly stronger than Lotus 3. So that does help in certain kind of more recent content, but
Mm-hmm.
it was a fairly small buff, and most people will probably um, hear me say a 5% buff to a rotation is actually pretty substantial. But given the use cases for Lotus and what you use it for, and then kind of comparing it with other things, it really just kind of closed the gap a little bit. But it's definitely not in your top tier options for kind of your primary damage output PA. So that's kind of the existing tech art customization now. I'm sure Chumbo. I haven't heard the interview, but I'm sure Chumbo talked about Dimray.
Oh yeah. We had a
from
good
a
conversation
hybrid.
about Dimray.
I don't know why Sega doesn't like Bo.
Yeah, we're working on that. We're trying to put that in the limelight a little bit.
That's just that one baffles me a little bit. But
we're going to talk about something I think that might kind of relate to this. So we're going to get to that in one of our other questions. So
yeah. It's why Dimray. It's that I'm sure that Chum also kind of talked about the use cases for some of the other ones. And I think just like with Lotus, where there's really only one that you're going to use 99.9% of the time, I think it's the case for like Hybrid Braver. 99.9% of the time, you're going to use wide Dimray because it does give you a filler, another option for a filler PA, particularly if you have the opportunity to pre-fire. And it's also very good if you have the ability to have a charged Dimray set of charged Dimray stacks on top of pre-firing the uncharged version of that. So, so that's kind of from the Hybrid Braver perspective. In terms of what's next, I can tell you what I would love to see.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about.
I would like to see Lilac get a potentially a damage reduction in return for vertical track. I don't think that's gonna happen.
I've seen crazier things happen. I feel like that's fair though. Like to have that better tracking overall in exchange for damage. I mean, like, what else are you really using it for, right?
Right. That's exactly it. It's that would, I would say that would fix a few more of Katana's longstanding issues. At the same time, I'm mixed about that because I think, particularly with the advent of step counter skip arts, that Lilac 3 can actually be pretty powerful. And even sometimes we will use Lilac 1 or Lilac 2. Typically Lilac 1 as a filler for things instead of Leaf almost in some circumstances. So if it were to change sort of the mechanics of it such that we wouldn't be able to use that or that was less effective, then that's sort of a trade-off and that would be very content dependent. My guess is they'll either do something for Lilac or they will do something for Scale, which is our sort of AoE mobbing, primarily mobbing PA. Because it's outside of mobbing and then outside of sort of edge cases for bossing, you aren't using Iris much. Honestly, I think the last boss that I've used that on extensively was Engoku in Stia, when it was hopping around because Lotus wouldn't track, and then you were confined to using Leaf, but that was very low damage. So you were actually better off using Iris because it has okay output for what it is. But it was better in that circumstance, and it would actually hit more consistently than if you were trying to leave as it was sort of leaping around after doing the 360 swing around its staff. So my guess is that it'll probably end up being something like damage buff or an attack speed thing to Iris Gale to try to, or something to modify maybe the first step of Iris Gale, which quite frankly I don't think I've ever seen anyone in earnest use Iris 1. Typically, when you're trying to use Iris 2 and Iris 3, you're using Leaf 1 as the lead in that combination. Or something else, like Lotus. So that could be interesting depending on what they did with it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that they're going to do anything with Leaf. And I think they need to kind of think about what they want Leaf to be, because it has become somewhat vestigial. Now that I think a lot of the higher end bravers have been exploring the kit, and a lot of folks have realized that in sort of those high intensity situations, yes, leafs and half leafs are really critical, but there are more and more situations in which you're really not using leaf, you're using lilac as a filler in some respects. So I think Sega probably needs to take more time with leaf. I really hope it's not something with leaf at this point, because I think that needs to be examined in terms of what it is and what it does, because the output is very, very low from leaf right now. So I think it'll either be lilac or iris.
So looking at the different individual abilities, thinking about Leaf and thinking about Lotus and Lilac and all of them, I know they buffed Lotus 1-2 stages, was basically the kind of go-to you go for the tech arts. Thoughts on buffing stage 3 of Leaf to kind of go along with that whole like try to combo abilities again sort of situation? Because I mean, I'm thinking about like when this was before, of course, the tech arts customization situation even came out to begin with, right? I was thinking about different ways that classes could, essentially take care of a lot of situations they're dealing with. And to me, in a lot of cases, Leaf was just the easy ability to use while there was high intensity, like moving around, like a lot of like basically high intensity situations, but playing Katana. But when the target was down, not moving, like Iris or I'm sorry, Lotus was just kind of like no brainer, go to no brain or go to Lotus, did more damage, just had a bit more animation lock. And I really thought they were just going to lean into like basically a tech arts they gave Bouncer, that the ability would just do more damage on downs. Like we have one of our tech arts customizations, which is used primarily for jet boots, funny enough, is that you do more damage with I almost called it Kestrel. With our Harrier ability, sorry, Kestrel's the name from base PSO2, but
yes.
with Harrier, you do more damage with Harrier on a target that's downed as opposed to when they're up and moving around. So I kind of thought Lotus would have something similar, but if they only buff the first two parts of it, what are your thoughts on them doing something similar to another ability, like giving maybe Leaf that extra bit of damage on the third stage, given maybe your target's downed or whatever it happens to be, or whatever have you, like maybe reducing the damage on the first two steps, increasing the damage on the third by like far, making it so you really don't want to use the first two steps. I'm not sure how that would really fit into the kit. What are your thoughts?
So for folks, to give folks a little context on what we're talking about with Leaf 3. So Leaf Stage 1 and Leaf Stage 2 kind of do are kind of a dual slash maneuver, right? And there's cancel frames in between each of those slashes, and they're pretty quick. They're each about just under 40 frames, but they don't do much damage, and they especially don't do too much damage when you kind of do half leaves, because the potency is backloaded and not front loaded. Leaf 3 is a very different photon art stage than the first two, and it's a single kind of massive sweeping slash, and it's about 40. I believe it's 46 frames, and it's 299 potency, so just under 300. It's become somewhat vestigial, even with step counter skip arts, because the last stage of Radiant Lilac is stage 3 is 345 potency. And for really not that many more frames, it's 52 frames for a Lilac stage 3 and 46 for Silverleaf Storm. So if you are coming off that step counter and you're looking to very quickly get an attack in before you lose your opportunity to attack coming off that step, you're going to do Lilac 3 and not Leaf 3, which I don't think is necessarily what they intended for Leaf. So I think it could be interesting if they did address Leaf Stage 3 and they made it sort of your an option where you let's say you step counter something and you're looking to do a quick follow-up attack, turning that into kind of a harder hitting stage of Leaf could be an interesting change to gameplay, but I don't know how. I guess for me, I don't know how deeply Sega necessarily is thinking about Leaf, and I would argue that like stage 1 and stage 2 of Leaf are also slightly underpowered. So I would actually be, in some respects, it would be interesting to see a modified stage 3, but in a lot of other respects, I'd be pretty disappointed if they didn't bump the damage up just a little bit on stage 1 and stage 2 to allow it to kind of keep up with other kind of filler options that some other classes might have for those, 15, 20 frame situations where they're just trying to squeeze a little tiny bit of extra damage out. Even if it was something like where they didn't change the potency per se, but they front loaded instead of back loaded the damage on stage 1 and stage 2 Leaf, that could be an interesting modifier, because that would actually be a pretty significant increase in output, about another 35, 36 potency. But it as of now, I could go either way on that one. I would be pretty disappointed if they didn't address stage 1 and 2, though.
That's fair. It's just more so looking at like, and you're absolutely right. They may not really understand fully how to address that in the proper way, or maybe looking into it as deep. So I was kind of thinking of something like maybe a little bit lighter, a bit easier to address overall. And I feel like the way they've made stage 1 and 2 of Leaf is more or less intended. Like stage 3 was like their big hitter, and stage 1 and 2 are kind of like their but it really just depends on where what the design team is looking to do with the abilities. So until we really know for sure, we really can't say. But I was just curious of your thoughts on that specifically. So it does lead into.
It was a good question.
Yeah, for sure. Appreciate it. So I did want to lead this into something else that I actually. This has been a conversation we've had with multiple different people when it comes down to the classes, and it's something that came up back in base PSO2 back in JP days. And to give a bit of history for those of you guys who haven't seen the previous interviews or anything along those lines, even for you as well, back in episode 5 of base PSO2, there was the release of Hero, and that caused a pretty heavy shakeup in the class dynamics to the point where Hero was so powerful, it basically trumped every other class in the game. There was no reason to play anything else outside of having one Tector and one Ranger. So if you thought things have gotten bad in certain circumstances, I promise you it has been far worse than you could ever imagine. It was literally to the point where we made jokes that you were either a hero, the one Ranger, the one Tector, or you were a detriment on everyone around you. So sometimes you were just the detriment, just depending upon you wanting to have fun. And that caused a huge shakeup in class balancing. I mean, a lot of classes got massively buffed to basically keep up with what the new standard was. And with that, there was a conversation that brewed of how weapons should be balanced and how they should be balanced with their own classes. A lot of classes had weapons that were basically balanced and set up in ways that you would essentially have a rotation between swapping between the weapons. Going solo with one weapon was almost like playing with one arm tied behind your back. And Sega eventually came out and said, well, we're making balance changes and we're making updates so that way every weapon feels as though it can stand on its own. There is no weapon that requires a secondary weapon to be able to do its basic functions, and you're going to be able to, to play your favorite weapon. That was a design point, a design stance, and they kind of rolled with that very, very well into the end of PSO2 and what it has become. Fast forward, we're now in NGS, and I feel like that isn't really the case anymore. There are some weapons that quite literally rely on other weapons, and if you're not using them, it feels like, again, you're playing with an arm tied behind your back. So some people feel like this is a design intentional, where you should have to play all the weapons in your class to be able to do proper amounts of damage. That's why multi-weapons exist, so on and so forth, where others feel like this is optional, where you shouldn't be forced to use all of your different weapons. It should be something that, you are a bit more powerful, so to speak, like maybe within like 1% or 2%, maybe within even 5%, maybe a bit more powerful, be able to do a bit more, or even just you might have an easier time versus the person who decided they want to specialize with their one weapon. Um, what camp do you fall in personally, or where do you feel like the balancing? And granted, we don't know because we haven't heard from SEGA yet, but what do you
Right.
feel like the balancing should be, respectively, when it comes down to weapons? Are you in the camp of like, hey, you should have to use both of your weapons to be able to really push out that high end of damage, and if you're not, it should be fairly penalizing? Or are you in the camp of like, hey, maybe it should be a bit closer, but realistically speaking, weapons should stand on their own by far? Like, how do you feel about that?
I think, and I'm obviously going to be biased in this response. I think because
Aren't we
I'm a
all?
single, I'm generally a single weapon uh, player, right? I do a lot of
Mm-hmm.
katana only stuff. I do feel that they should balance around every weapon being capable in and of itself. I appreciate that. I think from the developer standpoint, they introduced this wonderful new feature called multi-weaponing, and I think there was a vision of that being sort of a way of driving players towards the other option you laid out, which is you have to use every weapon in your kit. I
Mm-hmm.
think with like fighter, for example, um, that's absolutely the case. Like you're not, with a few exceptions, most folks aren't going to be using just knuckles. With one notable exception that I know of, you're going to be
I can
using
think of a name.
knuckles, and yes, we're probably thinking of the same person. Um,
I'm
and
assuming Sneak, a special small yellow robot.
uh, um, it it would typically be knuckles, twin daggers, and then you would have double saber on the side, either as a PB stick, but actually double saber decently does damage now too by itself.
Mm-hmm.
So like fighter's an example where yeah, the multi-weapon system was kind of integral, I think, in some respects to how the class was originally conceived of, and I think it's evolved since.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in some respects, away from that. I think with Braver, um, and I think you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not as familiar with post revision bouncer,
Mm-hmm.
but I think what folks were looking for was the ability of the weapons to stand on their own. But if you wanted to add a little more complexity to your gameplay, or if you wanted to squeeze a little more damage output out, you always had the option of using the other weapon in your class. So, like in Braver's circumstance, it was. I would love to see it to where Katana stands on its own and Bow stands on its own. But if you wanted to venture into more complex and sweatier territory, um, you could learn to integrate the two and get a little bit more out of the class from a damage standpoint and a complexity standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I would say that we're kind of, at least for Braver, it's kind of moving in the opposite direction of that right now. I think by the time folks see this, the Encore jump changes are going to be in place, and that's going to actually really hurt Braver, and it's going to really hurt Bow, at least
Mm-hmm.
until there's kind of more robust attention paid to the weapon. Um, because Encore Jump became so, along with Charge Flex, became sort of very integral to Bow's ability to kind of do what it can do as of today. Um, it post that change, it's going to be a very different world, and it's hybrid. Braver is going to go from what I was saying, it could be between 60-40 to 80-20. It's going to be kind of closer to like 90-10 or
Mm-hmm.
95-5, right?
Mm-hmm.
Almost kind of where it was at in the Kavaris days, where you were really, in a lot of respects, doing pre-charged, supercharged flex between bosses in a purple, for example. Um, so I think it's moving away from that. And while I'm on the topic of Encore Jump, I think that did need to happen. I'm not sure that that was intended behavior for Encore Jump. But that
Mm-hmm.
being said, like the reason Bo wasn't in even deeper despair at this point was because of Encore Jump,
Yep.
and it's gonna hurt that weapon, and it's gonna hurt Braver overall in the short and possibly the medium term. But other hope is that it'll become very evident how important Encore Jump was to Bow's damage output. And SEGA will see that and try to balance around post Encore Jump Bow, which is really, it just needs more potency for what it has now, right?
Exactly. No, for sure.
So that's I think that's kind of my philosophy. Is I would really love to see it to where any single weapon can solo clear any content with a sufficiently skilled player, without having to go through a lot of gyrations. But if you want to add and introduce more complexity, that rewards you also. So that's kind of where I'm at now with that. And I don't know how it is so much for Bouncer now post the revision, but I mean, I would imagine that maybe you can kind of tell me a little bit more about that from your perspective. But
Yeah,
imagine it's a little more that the weapons stand a bit more on their own. Is that pretty accurate assessment? Or?
That's more or less it. Like the weapons do pretty much stand. I mean, I would say I'd want more classes to kind of have that balance that Bouncer sort of does, but specifically on the Soaring Blade side. My Jet Boot brothers right now are going through some tough times. They're suffering from the success of not buffing something isn't always the answer. We've learned that the hard way, unfortunately. They are down to 3-button rotations and it's not fun. But from the Soaring Blade side of things, having Jet Boots as an offhand weapon or as a multi-weapon allows for very interesting use of what is it called? Jet Boots' weapon action counter. In situations where, let's say, like the bosses are swiping the field or attacking and we can't really counter anything specifically, we can use that weapon action counter to help store up a jolt for when the boss then becomes targetable. So it's, little nuances like that, situations where jet intensity is a better choice on like a target that's down if we have no other options available to us and it's PP positive. So that's super cool. So like, it's a bit more of a marriage between weapons on the Soaring Blade side. That and our PB is crap. It's really bad. So like having the option of Jet Boots' PB that also builds a jolt for them that does massive amounts of damage, like it's a nice way to cover that awful situation. I would like for them to make our PB not crap. It'd be nice to use it more often because I like the way it looks. But at this point, I'm literally just kicking a ball at things, whether or not it hits it a ton or not, because I'm getting a free jolt anyway. And the minimum of building the jolt plus that little that little bit of damage that the ball might have done is enough to make it already better than the Soaring Blade's PB, which is pretty sad.
Yeah, and like and it's likewise with like Bow, Photon Blast, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
if you're playing hybrid, even after the change, right, that fills your attack impact gauge using a Bow PB,
Mm-hmm.
and that can be advantageous if you have charge dim race stacks, and then you bow PA or you bow PB into say like a charged ceaseless on a down or a break.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of damage output. So there are still some things where bow actually does fill a little better in some circumstances than Katana can. And we kind of talked about that closer to the start of this interview, but it's definitely. It definitely doesn't add as much, and it especially won't add as much after the Encore Jump change. As it sounds like Jet Boots really adds to Soaring Blades.
Oh yeah, no, it's a lot. I mean, I'm not sure if you got a chance to watch the Soaring Blades interview, but it was a lot of me and Kai trying to figure out like, what can we really complain all that much about? Because it's a pretty good spot, at least for Soaring Blades overall. But I'm also in agreement. I know this kind of sucks. Again, I feel bad for my bow mains out there. I mostly feel bad for bow mains and for Tectors, honestly, in this situation. Though Tector's a bit of a different beast that I want to approach from a different perspective later on down the line. But the loss of Encore Jump, it does suck. But I'm gonna be real with you guys. It had to go. Like it was probably the dumbest thing I had seen, and I was really happy that Bouncer didn't use it anymore. That Encore Jump Fanatic Blade was probably like the most unfun, boring looking thing I'd ever seen as far as like how our kit worked. and I was really happy to see it go. I know some people were really sad because I know even at a certain point, Katana would use it for downs, um, for damage in general in some situations.
Mhm. Yeah, back in the
When
Redum days, that was our down
mhm,
rotation. Was if fan blade was up, right? We just pop fan
mhm,
blade and encore jump fan blade on the weak point on a down, and
yep,
that was about, if I remember correctly, it was about 10% better than Lotus 123, even with
yep, it
the
was really
not having
good.
the main weapon.
Yeah, it was really strong. You could not ignore it. It was fantastic, and I hated it. I thought it was like the most silly looking thing. It was funny, like the first few times you did it, like just bouncing on something's head as you're dealing damage to it. I thought that was cool, but like after a while, it was like, okay, I'm glad this is gone. But realistically, it needed to go for them to really like hone in on where damage needs to be, right?
Yeah, and they shouldn't
Like,
and they shouldn't be balancing around something like Encore Jump. They should be balancing around the weapons and their intrinsic abilities and the skill trees themselves,
mhm,
and that damage output that's intrinsic to the weapon. So you can't like so in a lot of respects, it's almost good that Encore Jump is finally getting addressed because and I'm probably sounding like a broken record at this point. I'm hoping upon hope that it will lead to Sega taking a hard look at Bo finally and saying, okay, Encore Jump distorted what it was able to do, and
mhm.
now we need to like really address this. So
And I'll sort of kind of like piggyback off of that, and kind of add a little bit, I would say a little hope for some people. I know some people aren't always hopeful in these situations. um Feedback does get looked at. It's surprising to think about, but like I know some people think, oh, well, they're not paying attention, they don't listen to us, they don't listen to these videos. The Discord that they have, Twitter posts, things of that sort, it does get read. It does. I can't tell you who and exactly what, but I have seen and I have talked to people, and I know that these things do get back to the dev team. They do see them. They do hear us. Funny enough, even I'm not sure if you saw the video, but like even the talks of our wedding we had in PSO2 has made it back to like the dev team and the producers and things like that. So they are paying attention. I promise you, it gets seen. So I would say, for my bow mains out there that are struggling now, that Encore is going to, by the time this goes out, yes, Encore will be gone. But that are struggling right now with the loss of Encore Jump, provide feedback, mention these sort of things, talk about it in the Discord, do it in a way that you would want to hear someone talking to you. Because I promise you, the easiest way to get ignored is to be belligerent and ridiculous. That gets thrown out so fast, it's not even funny. So just as like kind of a side thing, absolutely provide that feedback because it does get looked at. So anyway, moving on past that, this is the fun part of the interview that I like. Honestly, it's so different for everyone, and maybe yours have changed since the last time we talked about this. So I'm actually curious. So near the end of this, we've always talked about how everyone has different things they want to see for their weapon, right? Some ridiculous, some like that are down to earth that make a lot of sense. So you could, I'm gonna say, I always say, what's one thing you would like to see? No one ever has one. They always have like three or four. But what do you want to see? If you could say like, hey, look, Stay is definitely gonna see this. What would you want them to see or change specifically for your weapon, moving forward in the future of NGS? Like, what sort of changes would you be looking at?
I think for me, it kind of comes down into three categories. I talked a lot about this before, but some additional option for burst. So something that's not Brave Combat finisher.
Hmm.
It Katana really needs that. Um, Again, to make it a complete weapon at this point. Um, so that's thing one. Um, Mobility is something else I talked about. Um, you know, if we remember back to base PSO2 Braver, and you mentioned Asagiri earlier. The good old days of Asagiri, it was the fastest PA movement PA in the game,
Uh-huh.
and it was even faster than the dash pads on
Yep.
some quests, right? And it was iframed, so it was like it's just between that, Tunka, Guren, like you had a lot of movement and repositioning options, horizontal and vertical. Um, and that allowed Braver to be a fairly, Katana Braver to be a fairly dynamic class. Now, this version of Braver is clearly meant to be very rooted, and I understand that. Um, but for me, I would say, from an improved mobility standpoint, better some option for vertical tracking.
Hmm.
And yes, I know that when you have Brave Combat up, if you've taken the skill, it will, if you would use Katana normals, it will seek you to the target, vertical or other, or horizontally. But that's very small. Those are
I'll go
very small.
as
Yeah,
a
those are
not
very
braver main.
small
I'll go
shifts.
ahead and say that doesn't count. It's not enough.
Yeah, that
It's
doesn't that's not going to get you anywhere.
no. You need
Um,
something on demand, so that's
so,
understandable.
so you need something that's on demand, um, and then just speed. So a little speed boost to Lilac um, would probably help make that a little bit more of an effective movement PA. And then I think the last thing, and I talked before about um, complexity and kind of hybrid braver in particular, it does add a little bit of extra complexity to the Katana experience for those of us that are more Katana biased.
Hmm.
But I think more mechanics, additional mechanics that are intrinsic to Katana. So, for example, like step counter skip arts, that was a step in the right direction in my mind. That was, sort of an additional tool, an additional option, and it really unlocked really a lot of different options to consider in different situations. Whereas before, it might have just been simply a debate over, can I set up fearless, and if not, I just have to weapon action. Um, Now you have to really now sit down and consider and out using the DPS counter. Um, which is better? Do I step counter into a PA3, which PA3 will fit? Is that better than doing a guard counter, using that to cancel out of something? Is it better for me to try to set up as frame perfect as possible a fearless attitude? Um, am I doing a step one or step two PA into that fearless attitude, which will then bring it to step three as well? Those are all sort of that increased the complexity of Katana in ways that I think when it was first announced and it first came out, I don't think anyone anticipated just how much that was going to. But I think something additional to Katana, for example, in base we had stances. So you had the weak point stance and sort of the non weak point stance.
Hmm.
Um, so you were able to kind of switch and toggle between those two things. We also had the gear gauge in base, but of course that went through a number of different evolutions
Hmm.
over time. But you had the gear gauge and the ability to do a release using Katana combat
Hmm.
finisher. Um, those are all things that could provide interesting mechanics, and there's now precedent for them because classes like Slayer, for example, and Waker got mechanics very similar to that.
Hmm.
So I think that would be interesting to add a little more diversity to Katana gameplay. Um, Give us something to manage, and maybe something associated with that is the thing that gives us, that additional burst damage option. So maybe it solves two problems with one solution. So those
Yeah,
those are kind of the three big things I'd be interested in kind of seeing progress.
I think it'd be interesting to see. I think a big one would be, and I don't feel like this is unfair to ask, but like something to do with a gauge that kind of tied into a build-up skill. A lot of classes have those now. A lot of weapons have those, and katanas is kind of like, I guess you have. Why can't I think of the name of it all of a sudden? Um, wow, it completely lost my train of thought. The skill you guys use you pop and use it immediately. It's like on a 15-second cooldown. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head.
Brave combat.
Yeah, Brave Combat. Yeah, you have
Yeah.
Brave Combat. It's not really a build-up skill. Everyone else kind of has one of it. You really just have like a cooldown itself, and it's not unfair to ask to have something like that. I mean, look at Soaring Blades. I have both Fanatic Blade as like my cooldown, and then I also have Pinion as my build-up skill. Both of those things do kind of fit in there, and it'd be interesting to see that if you guys had something like a gauge ability that you could build up, maybe spend in certain situations, maybe build up in certain charges, and could take care of not only the burst damage situation, but also could take care of the PP situation, as a lot of build up skills also just regen PP for some reason. I didn't know that until they added it to Pinion, and then everyone told me that other build up skills had it, and I had no idea. But it's definitely something I feel like could be something that's added. But I'll go one step further, because it's something we talked about in the last interview, and it stuck with me so well because I was just so blown away by how ridiculous this is. Your lost fearless attitudes. How is that a thing? For those who don't know what we're talking about, apparently I learned the
That
last
would
time we
be
did this interview that you
that would
can
that,
lose fearless attitude by landing.
yes.
What?
So
Go ahead and explain that one. Like, I was like, you've got to be kidding me.
this is such an edge case, and it does actually come up. Not so much anymore. Well, no, I take that back. It has come up with MDFA a bit before I changed my approach to the incoming clause. If you use a normal attack at any stage of normal attack, it will pop a fearless barrier. But unlike when you do a photon art and you pop your fearless barrier, it doesn't hold you vertically in place. So, like if I use Leaf or Lotus and then let my fearless barrier come out, the end of that PA's animation frames, you will hang for most of the duration, I think a couple frames short, at the same elevation you were when you finished that PA. And that allows you some ability to maintain verticality, not create it, but maintain it, which is really useful when you're fighting things like Didal or Dustal or what have you, or even things like Renus. If you, for some reason, run out of PP, if you try to normal in midair, it will allow you to also have a fearless barrier, but that fearless barrier won't hold you vertically in place, so you'll fall. If you aren't careful, particularly when you're fighting certain things, where you're kind of hovering just slightly off the ground, if you have that fearless barrier out and you land coming off of a normal, the barrier disappears. And I cannot tell you how many times that has killed me. Particularly when I haven't realized that I was hovering ever so slightly. And for some reason, it was a semi-active phase. I was running low on PP, or I anticipated I was going to get it down, and I was like, okay, I need to do something really quickly to top off my PP. That's PP neutral. And so I throw normal. And that's a common trick for Bravers. If you need to very quickly squeeze in and top off your PP, you can throw out a normal and use fearless attitude, and you get a whole lot of PP back. But it can also, if you're not paying enough attention to what you're doing, that can kill you. So it's such a small thing, and you would only notice it frankly, if you're doing cheeky and or desperate things with that particular maneuver. But it is annoying, and it's somewhat inexplicable why the other fearless barriers hold you at elevation, but if you throw a normal attack, it doesn't. So it's a little bizarre. It's so small, but it's also like it's a quality of life thing. But I definitely wouldn't put it on my top.
That way. It's just insane that happens, and I think it's primarily. I think this is just the way that normal attacks work specifically, because most PAs that Bouncer uses as well will have you hang in the air, and of course we don't have a fearless barrier, so it's not really that's what's happening there. But most of them will have you hang in the air. But if you're normal attacking, you start falling much faster. I think that's just a way that normal attacks are coded. But specifically, Braver has that issue. Like, you land and then bam, fearless attitude barrier is gone. So I don't know if they just make it so it doesn't disappear when you land, or they change normal attack so that you hang in the air when you normal attack, or what they want to do in that situation. Because we have options to move to the ground, right? Like, if I need to get to the ground quickly, I can just ground smash and it's fine. Or if I have I can lock on, use a specific PA, and I'll move down towards the ground. So that's not an issue. So having normal attacks have you hang would be perfectly fine. But it just blew my mind that I never considered that as an issue. That like when you land, you would lose your fearless barrier. That's so silly because it's very easy. Like at least for me, when I was learning to play, Katana for the brief stint that I played Katana, one of the things I would do is if I was trying to go for a fearless barrier and I didn't know the timing of my PA, I could very easily just throw out a normal and then get a fearless barrier that way. And as I was getting more used to it, of course, I would do that less, and I would rely more on the end of the PA and then throw out a normal if I absolutely needed to. But like that could really hurt someone's learning process. Like if I played long enough and it came across that, I probably would be like, dude, this is the dumbest thing ever. Why? Like it's such a small problem, but like it's still such a problem. So
Yeah, and it came up a little bit more recently with MDFA when I was, I would put Fearless out off of a
mhm,
PA and try to do PA like Lilac 3. So I do like
mhm,
Lilac 2, set up Fearless Attitude from an incoming claw. Let the claw hit me. I'd do my PA 3, and then I would throw a normal to set up because there wasn't enough time to do um, Lilac 1, Lilac 2. I would throw out a normal
mhm,
to bring Fearless up, but then sometimes it would catch the hitbox of the claw and it would raise me slightly off the ground. And so I would throw my normal, but I was, the equivalent of like probably like 6 inches off the ground, and I would drop, and then I would all of a sudden I'm flying backwards,
yep.
not realizing that I was hovering.
That's so
So
silly.
and that's the kind of stuff that you won't really see in videos that people post.
Yeah.
The for every one video that speedrunners post, there's probably about 100 or a few hundred attempts behind it that had
Hmm.
many things like that went horribly wrong, or just like you just had a moment and you just lost what you were doing.
Yeah.
So that's a fun little insight into that world. But
If you guys ever get the
it,
chance, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
it's so subtle though, like but when you spend 6,000, I think I've spent like 6,000 hours with this weapon.
Hmm.
um it's something that like I wouldn't rank it in my top 3, but I would love it if sometime they fixed it, right? it's
Yeah,
just
for
it's just
sure.
one of those obscure things.
For sure, for sure. And like if for any of you guys who haven't seen the other interviews, if you're just curious about a little bit of an insight into the woes of what happens when you're trying to speedrun things, roll back to the Ranger interview, Kasumi's interview, and look at the very even if you don't watch the whole thing, just watch the very end of it. I promise it's worth your time. A nice little reel of shenanigans that happens when it comes to launcher PBs. Pretty funny stuff. But I digress. I believe we kind of covered a little bit of everything. Was there anything else you wanted to mention in passing that maybe we didn't get to or that I didn't really talk too much about?
No, I think if we're kind of getting near the end here, I think the thing I would say, for folks that are interested in getting into katana, I think, and this is probably true of every weapon, I think your your best bet truly is like looking for those opportunities after you've learned the basics, after you've learned how to sort of reflexively fearless attitude, and it's looking for those opportunities to live in the iframe less and live in risk more. And the more that you become comfortable with that, and the more that you learn those move sets of the things that you're fighting, the more satisfying I feel like the weapon gets. And like once you've got a fight like perfectly down with katana, um, it is really just an absolute blast to play. Um, so I really like, for those that I think look at it and go, well, that's easy, or I've figured it out very quickly. Give it another shot and try like just try pushing yourself and pushing yourself and pushing yourself a little more every time you fight something. And then I think what you find is that there is a little more depth to the weapon than kind of initially meets the eye when you're first introduced to it. And it can be very satisfying when you figure out those things um, about the weapon. And you can get into a really nice rhythm in some fights with it. So that was just going to be the thing I would close with is give it a chance. Um, and just have fun with it. Um, so
For sure. No, and it's and I to kind of parrot that as well. Like, if you really think about it, a lot of and I say most classes in NGS at a very basic level aren't too difficult. Some more so than others, but like most classes are fairly straightforward, fairly simple. It's when you put the extra time in and you put the extra nuance and you really look a lot deeper and you really try to push out more damage that you realize some of the more nuances of the individual classes and what they really can bring to the table and what was required of the player to be able to get that damage out. And Katana definitely is one of those that I feel like it can almost be a little bit what's what I'm looking for here, polarizing, how quickly you can jump from like, oh, this is like one of the easiest things I've done to like, holy crap, there's so much more to this I really never thought about. And it's silly, or not silly, but it's interesting how far in the other direction you can go when you really put the time in. Because if you guys look, I mean, I feel like there's something that doesn't really get enough attention, but like, if you guys really look at the Katana speedrunners or just speedrunners in general as they're doing content, like it is very different than what you would think that you're actually doing.
Oh
If you
yeah.
blink when it comes to Katana, you may miss some of the counters because of how quickly some things get kind of fit in there. So
And
it's
also
pretty
those
cool.
canceled PAs, things that
Hmm.
we do to try to squeeze in those little gaps. Um, it can actually be somewhat difficult to see if you don't slow down some of those videos because they're happening within the span of 10 or 15 frames.
Hmm.
Quarter of a second, sixth of a second.
Yeah, it's
So like that's what I mean when I say like dig in and press with the weapon, and you'll see pretty quickly like there's a lot more to it than weapon action and counter plus.
absolutely, absolutely. Well, it has been a pleasure having this conversation with you. It's
Yeah,
actually been
absolutely.
very eye opening. Contrary to popular belief, I don't hate katanas, guys. I know if those of you guys who hang around my Twitch stream a lot feel as though me and Katana are not friends. Katana would have been the weapon I actually played if I didn't play Soaring Blades, funny enough. I did play Braver, and I still have, I think, one of my favorite camos in the entire game. I say next to Lemire Fawns, is still Liberation. God forbid they ever bring that camo back. Let my Katana mains have their camo. Like, it's very sad that you guys don't get it. People who didn't play back in base game. I'm not sure. You didn't play base, or wait, no, you said you played global,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I've got it. I have all the mission pass camos.
Yeah. So hopefully, hopefully you guys get a chance to get a hold of that Katana again, because I don't think that thing has ever come back, which is so sad. Such a cool camo. But I digress. I'm bad at ending videos. If you guys have any questions or anything along those lines, feel free to toss in the comments below. I'm sure everyone will be checking out the comments. I'm sure you're going to be checking out the comments as well for anything that anyone might want to know about. You guys have probably seen tons of footage as this entire interview has gone on. So that'll be a lot of that stuff will be linked in the video description. We'll have links to not only the Katana Braver guide, it also includes links to the bow guide as well in case you're on that end, and hybrid braver and stuff like that, and including shout outs to any individual people. Speaking of, was there any individual shout outs you wanted to go ahead and give before we close out here today?
I'll highlight some of the same folks I did kind of the last time we talked, and that's Ribeyes, who I've mentioned a couple times in this interview. He's just he's an excellent katana and hybrid braver.
Mm-hmm.
Chirai, who I think is you see him a little more on Twitter than you do on YouTube, but he's another excellent. He's another ship one braver along with Ribeyes. He's excellent. He's a little bit newer to kind of the speedrunning piece, but he's just he had a really strong MDFA clear
Mm-hmm.
recently that and has generally been up there with Ribeyes in terms of like arcs record times and things of that nature. Um, and then in terms of hybrid braver, Argus, who's another throwback name to the base days. He's still out there. He's primarily JP, but that's somebody that still from time to time puts up hybrid braver videos. So it's kind of interesting to watch the things that he comes up with. And then of course for Bo, Chumbo, of course, is the main person for global for that half of Braver. So if you're looking to either learn something new about Braver and haven't played with Bo, or if you're just looking to kind of learn a little bit more about what bow can do for Katana in the hybrid scenario, that's just a good a good person to kind of watch and learn from, because he's absolutely squeezed every single ounce out of that weapon. So
Oh yeah, for sure. And like I mentioned, this is after I did the bow interview, and Trumbo is an absolute pleasure. So you guys should definitely check them out. They're awesome. But yeah, again, thanks for joining me today. Everything will be linked in the comments in the video description. I know they didn't really get a chance to shout yourself out, but I will be linking all of your socials in the video description, so don't worry too much about that. But yeah, again, I'm bad at doing outros. Thanks for watching all in, guys. You guys are awesome. Take care, my friends. Peace out.